Hi everyone. So my name is Dr. Mathilde Metro. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Social and Policy Sciences at the University of Bath. It's such a pleasure to come to this and organize this webinar with Bond today. We think it's a very timely discussion to be had and to pause and question as to the key principles and applications of humanitarian principles and discuss the potential crisis that we see emerging in this field. I personally research development, and this is part of our discussion today would be around the nexus between humanitarianism and development. Most of my work is ethnographic, and my geographical focus is mostly on Bangladesh. You can find some more information on my profile in the chat. Naomi, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. I'm Naomi Pendle. I'm a lecturer at the University of Bath, and yeah, thank you for joining us. I know life is very busy for all of you, but I think it's so important to think about these bigger questions. So thank you for kind of stepping out of your busy days for a few minutes. So my main focus is on humanitarian protection and also the kind of politics of famine in my research. So I've done work on kind of humanitarian protection, but also kind of comparing that with self-protection strategies and UN kind of peacekeeping protection strategies and the kind of politics and dynamics of when everyone is trying to stay safe or keep people safe and how that actually plays out. And my geographic focus has largely been on kind of East Africa and the Horn of Africa, and I've done a decade of kind of ethnographic work now in South Sudan and kind of bordering countries. So yeah, that's me.
And hi everyone, I'm Tawsif, Dr. Tawsif Mir. I work at the Department of Social and Policy Sciences. And regarding my work, I also work on humanitarian crises and conflicts, wherein I basically try and focus on the popular experiences under those circumstances. And overall, my specific focus is usually to understand how people in their everyday lives make use of different institutions, formal and informal, to give a semblance of ordinariness to their everyday lives amid all the crises that's unfolding around them. How do they imagine to dream, get educated, navigate their lives around the crises that's unfolding around them? In terms of geography, my specialization focuses basically on the Indian-controlled Kashmir, where I've been doing my ethnographic research for like about a decade now. And I'm also a part of the Development Studies organization, the Development Studies Association, where basically I have been working on this idea of decolonization, doing race audits and understanding how development studies and the larger field of humanitarianism can be decolonized. So these are the kind of questions that I basically engage on. And thanks for having me, and thanks a lot for everyone for joining us.
So I guess I'll kick off the conversation. Part of this idea of where we're asked to put this webinar together, we started discussing the good, the bad, and the ugly of humanitarian principles, and that's how Naomi, Tawsif, and I started having quite an interesting conversation about how our field of studies relate. I study extreme poverty and I study vulnerabilities, and obviously there's a lot of overlap and synergies in what we see in each other's work. And what we've seen today and what we've seen more topically on the news also brought us together to kind of discuss the challenges perhaps that humanitarianism is facing today. I'm not really an expert on humanitarianism, so you might be wondering, what am I doing here? I'll be mostly drawing on my colleagues' expertise and asking questions that relate to the field that I study, development. Part of the question I wanted to ask Naomi and Tawsif is, what is humanitarianism when we see the scale of civilian casualties that we see today? We've seen it in the example between the conflict in Israel, between Israel and Palestine and Sudan, and we've seen uncounted deaths on a scale that is unimaginable. It does make people wonder, what does humanitarianism stand for? What is humanitarianism today? How would you go about defining it? Naomi?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that's where we're all kind of starting from, right? It feels like a particular moment. Obviously, I do a lot of work in South Sudan, and a lot of my colleagues that I research with and friends we're kind of caught up in the conflict in Sudan as well as in South Sudan, and I think we're all watching the headlines all the time, and I think we have a kind of deep, like, what is going on, and why is the international community not able to kind of protect people better? It feels like a real moment of crisis, like crisis in the world, or kind of multiple kind of overlapping crises in the world, but also a crisis in humanitarianism itself. Like, what is this thing that we are so invested in if it isn't even able to keep people safe? And something that we often come back to when we're teaching on the kind of master's course at Bath is the kind of the history of it, and actually how humanitarianism itself has been built around kind of moments of deep kind of global crisis, and often a kind of public moral outcry in response to us as a kind of collective humanity getting things very badly wrong. So it's often when things have got badly wrong that change happens, and humanitarianism has kind of been formed, and the ideas that are deeply embedded in humanitarianism have been formed through these moments of crisis and these moments of a kind of like, we cannot do this again, we cannot see this happen again, we must do better. And of course, what that means is then really shaped by the kind of politics and social dynamics of the day. So as you know, like, Western humanitarianism has its roots in kind of the mid-1800s in Europe, with Europeans, so a kind of local response, Europeans seeing Europeans dying on the battlefield, seeing soldiers dying on the battlefield, seeing them not being cared for in the midst of conflict, and having a very kind of compassionate response, a local response to be provided by local people to those dying, but that this would also kind of involve commitments at a kind of national level of how you would care for soldiers who are wounded and dying on the battlefield. But a real response to kind of, this is a crisis, this is kind of death and suffering that we don't want to see. And so humanitarianism was founded, or kind of the Western ideas of humanitarianism that we have. Then again, after the Second World War, and a kind of public moral outcry after realizing that the Holocaust had happened, after seeing the full scale of that horror, and much of the kind of humanitarian architecture that we have today, the humanitarian industry, comes in that kind of post-World War II period, and a real kind of response to this cannot happen again. And obviously in the world at the time, what we were seeing was the kind of independence of many countries around the world, and the independent struggles and the suffering as a kind of legacy of colonialism. So again, a kind of moral response. Again, after the Rwandan genocide in the 1990s, 800,000 people killed in 100 days, and a sense around the world afterwards, looking back, thinking we can't do that again. And in that kind of 1990s moment, you have a massive shift in the humanitarianism to protection. Before, you just had the International Committee of the Red Cross and the UNHCR with a protection mandate. After the kind of end of the 90s into the early 2000s, you have this growth of commitment to protection. Everyone wants to keep civilians safe, whether that's UN peacekeepers, various NGOs, everyone has that kind of commitment. So I think we are constantly responding to crises and changing our focus and saying, this cannot happen again. But I also wonder if we are always changing enough. I think the story of humanitarianism isn't always of change. It's of crisis and an awareness of that. But actually, if we think about the everyday, if we think about what actually happens, how people experience humanitarianism, we see again and again kind of patterns, such as encampment. Encampment often seems to be the answer, or often has been delivered by humanitarians as the answer. You know, from the 60s and the Biafra wars to the refugee camps around the world in the 80s and 90s to, you know, more recently, the protection of civilian sites in South Sudan. There's a kind of default sometimes to ideas of what we've done before, and a kind of default to not changing. So there's change and crisis, but then also kind of repetitiveness. And there's also this kind of concern of who gets to define the crises that will shape humanitarianism. You know, lots of my work is about listening to individual stories of kind of South Sudanese and Sudanese who move. And, you know, when I think about kind of war widows who have been, you know, widows in South Sudan, fled to refugee camps in Sudan, and then have multiple children die of severe illness in those refugee camps, have then ended up last year having to flee from Khartoum because of the war that erupted there last April. Does her moments of crisis always lap onto our moments of crisis? Her crisis has lasted 30, 40 years. It's a protracted crisis. It's a crisis that sometimes has overlapped with international attention and sometimes hasn't. And so I think that there's always a big question for us of kind of whose crises are shaping a humanitarianism, and And do we really allow humanitarianism to change to address the kind of crises that we should focus on? I'll hand back over to you, Mathilde.
It's really interesting what you were saying, because often we've got this idea that, organizations learn through crisis, and crises are big trigger points of juncture, for learning for organizations and people within them. It's interesting what you were saying about crisis, not necessarily, driving significant change or incremental change, maybe. I wonder how you would see then the field having evolved from what you were saying the outset to after World War II, and that being defined on quite Western terms. How does the field learn then? Maybe Klausi?
Thank you, Mathilde, and thank you, Naomi, for the wonderful summing up of this history in such brief time. I mean, wonderful. So basically, I'll build upon what Naomi said about learning lessons. Building on my own kind of research, I believe it's usually the larger political structures that define and inform the action that happens on the ground. For instance, like before going into the context of this change, some of the things that I've seen and engaged with people, which popularly is now the kind of the talk for a couple of years. For instance, there is this larger cherry picking of conflicts and humanitarian crises that get attention, and others remain sort of like unattended in a way in terms of the international humanitarian aid architecture or the kind of international attention that comes through. Having said that, all kinds of humanitarian crises, they're horrible. They are definitely terrible and completely avoidable, and all solidarities for them. But around 2020, what we see, number one, is the vaccine apartheid. I mean, there is a huge cry about humanitarianism all being equal, but there are a group of countries who are controlling almost all the vaccines and they're letting others die. That's one thing. Immediately after that, what's happening is that a horrible and bloody war breaks out in Ukraine, the Russian aggression. People start talking about that and they're pouring their hearts out. But for many people, the other question was that, oh yeah, definitely we are participating in that. But what's also happening is that there is one of the largest humanitarian crises as underlined by the United Nations in Yemen, where people in millions would starve to death. There's Afghanistan where people would starve to death and their assets are being frozen. But your hearts are pouring out to Ukraine, which is quite well-deserved, quite due, but at the same time, you're neglecting something else. And those calls have again been quite reinforced when we talk about the current situation that has unfolded in Gaza, where, we see these whole muted and very, very lackluster calls from humanitarian organizations about a ceasefire or about the humanitarian pauses, whereas at the same time, there is this false equivalence that's being drawn between the Palestinians in Gaza and the massive war machine of an apartheid state like Israel, and a false equivalence of guilt and blame on both the parties. And in terms of the interventions, what we've seen, for instance, many people that I've met have been arguing about these massive marches that are being popularly done, but at the same time, the humanitarian organizations that otherwise champion the causes, as we say, of humanitarianism, they're nowhere to be seen, not even a single banner of theirs. So that's raising many questions for the people. And that's what brings me to this idea of change that we talk about. Basically, when I engage with this idea of modern humanitarianism, something that we can talk about later in further detail, is that the kind of change that it saw was around 1990s, where we saw these crises like the conflict or the crises in Somalia in 1993, then we saw in Rwanda, and then also we saw something happening in Srebrenica. So these were the kind of crises where some things became quite clear that it was a new war kind of situation that was unfolding. That means the wars, they were no longer being fought on the boundaries, they were coming into the localities, and the major casualties, they were no longer military personnel, but civilians. And the other thing was that now the amount of casualties, it had intensified. A growing call is coming through that, okay, now you can't only be very neutral, but you need to take a rights-based approach, which actually coincided with this eruption or the mainstreaming of neoliberal agenda as the main economic ideology in the world as we see. So what happened was that humanitarianism as a change, as a paradigm shift, was not only seen as something that believes in humanity and practices neutrality, but there was a very equivocation of this rights-based approach. That means you're doing this humanitarian relief, but at the same time, you're also advocating and defending human rights. And you're not only giving this relief, that means people are dying or there's a crisis and you're giving food, water, and shelter. No, but there has to be more of what they call the sustainable aid. Sustainable aid in the sense that you're also doing this peace building, reconstruction, post-conflict reconstruction, conflict resolution, and other things. And this was justified that in this sense, this new humanitarianism that's actually having a paradigm shift from the modern kind of humanitarianism that we had seen thus far is more in line with the moral coherence and is more efficient in solving the problems, because you can't just go into the ground and say, if people are dying or getting killed, that's none of my business. That's what was actually highlighted in principle. And something that came through this was this idea of triple nexus. Triple nexus in the sense that this humanitarian aid or humanitarian intervention, it incorporates this idea of peace building, post-conflict reconstruction, and also this idea of development intervention into its orbit. It's kind of like blurring these boundaries. But at the same time, the larger guiding principle in this was this neoliberalism, where the interest, apart from altruism, was basically the guiding principle for these organizations or humanitarian interventions. And as a result of these larger political structures interacting with each other, we see the kind of manifestations on the ground where you have certain crises that are being advocated for, but there are certain major crises that are being lost, that are being forgotten, that are being muted. The other important bit in this was when you talk about this very idea of rights, that's quite complex. Who gets to decide whose human rights in a given conflict situation would be more important than the other? So those were the kind of things. And the other kind of like questions, moral questions that it raised in terms of like, do you look for addressing the root causes, or do you try to save people? For instance, for the root causes that you're advocating that you need more holistic solutions, you start building these peace, conflict transformation and other things, which are very time consuming. And would that mean if you prefer that thing, you let the people die till then because you're just saying that addressing those structural violences would save more people in the end? So these were the kind of like tensions that we see, number one, in terms of cherry picking, number second, in terms of the tension between this altruism and national interest. And the other important thing being the political kind of ideologies behind that, where certain interests were promoted at the cost of others. And one important thing where I would like to end was that in terms of this overall idea of humanitarian intervention that then was promoted after the 1990s, that it's not only humanitarian aid, but peace building, human rights, development intervention. One thing that was actually mainstreamed through that and quite promoted was this idea of resilience or development-oriented humanitarian intervention. That means you're doing this humanitarian intervention, but at the same time, you're sort of like preparing these people, preparing these communities to be resilient enough to handle these situations when they come in future. Whether such a thing actually works on the ground and what it means when you critically try to assess and analyze it is a topic of debate, actually, and something that we encounter in the larger development studies as well, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. The word resilience is a huge buzzword in development and humanitarian fields alike. Very interesting. Very interesting how you put together, and explain how humanitarianism coincided or converged together with other powerful dynamics, more global dynamics of neoliberalism, etc., and that compound into what we can see today and shape the kind of structures that we can see today. So you're saying actually there's a lot more politics to be understood behind the field, underpinning the field almost. It's interesting, therefore, to reflect. I don't know, how would you say, what's the field managed to achieve? Is everything doom and gloom in humanitarianism? Is there space for seeing hope in what the field has achieved? Is the field fit for purpose as it's developed, ad hoc and, as a crises and accidents? I don't know. Naomi, how would you reflect on what the field has achieved or not achieved, and maybe the challenges ahead?
Yeah, thank you. So I mean, I think lots of us will have examples from our own work and things we've done and places we've been where we can kind of see how humanitarianism and humanitarian efforts have helped people in really difficult situations, and actually where people would kind of report some kind of positive kind of consequence of these interventions. And there's work recently on kind of famines by people like Alex Duval that have said, if we look over the last few decades, kind of since the 80s and 90s, like famines no longer kill in the same way they used to because of large scale aid interventions. And actually people do, they get hungry, they get incredibly food insecure, they reach kind of famine point or near famine point. But actually kind of the systematic delivery of humanitarian aid will often stop them tipping over. It stops famines killing. And therefore, to some extent, you can see that kind of maybe humanitarianism in that kind of life-saving situation around food insecurity, there are examples where I think people would say it saved lives. And I'm sure in many different kind of sectors and spaces that there are examples. But also with all of those things, there's big problems. And I think the big problems, all of us, like we also know them, we're often living alongside them and we're struggling with them. And food insecurity and famine is another kind of clear example of where there have been incredible problems, that food aid has been manipulated. It's been used as, like, famine's been used as a weapon of war and starvation's been used as a weapon of war. So has food aid. Food aid has been positioned to move populations, to move them away from where kind of warring parties want them to be, or sometimes to make them even more vulnerable, or access has been denied, so aid cannot get through. I mean, we've seen that in South Sudan, we see that in Sudan, we see that in Ethiopia recently, and how that kind of aid can be so kind of easily kind of controlled politically. I guess the worst example of that comes in the 1990s in Sudan, where the kind of clear political control of humanitarian aid moved populations, made them much more vulnerable than they were before, and 100,000 people starved in the Bahr Ghazal famine in the 90s. And it feels like a long time ago. It's not that long ago, really. I mean, I work in those places and people very much have those memories of, people dying along the streets and in the places where they lived, and people know where the graves are. And that was a mistake of the humanitarian system. And I think it still happens, of course, because there is politics involved, because in the kind of the act of being humanitarian, you are trying to save lives, you're trying to support people. But when war is going on, and especially in wars that target civilians, where civilians are not set apart from the war objectives, but might well be a target of the war objective, whether that is to kill them and harm them, or whether that is to move them as a large population. And therefore, humanitarianism, as it intervenes in those situations, as it saves lives, becomes inherently political. And to some extent, it can't avoid that. And therefore, I think there's again and again the question of what is driving humanitarianism, and how does it, or should it, maintain this kind of neutrality in incredibly difficult kind of political context where civilians might be targeted, but also where the funders of humanitarian aid might have their own political interests. So we really, for example, see that in Afghanistan, how, as the US and the UK and European donors, aid donors were there and active, were also had very kind of clear and explicit political interests, also had kind of a military kind of presence with their political interests, and were using aid to build relationships at the same time. So in those contexts, how did those kind of certain political interests in the war kind of intervene with relationships of trust on the ground for Afghan people? And I think we still see that kind of playing out, the kind of loss of trust, the loss of solidarity, the loss of kind of understanding that many Afghans felt in relation to the humanitarian community, because many humanitarians got quite embroiled in the kind of political dynamics of their donors, and even the kind of strongest, kind of most pro-neutrality humanitarian organizations found it hard to stay out of that politics. But it's a hard one, because many people again and again, and the people we kind of try and serve, they know that actually what will really save them is a kind of political solution, that actually the most life-saving thing will be for the conflict to stop, and that is a political act. And so what they are often desiring is solidarity. So how do we remain neutral then? Do we take a political position? And I think this is going to become a bigger and bigger question for humanitarians as the world repolarizes. Like I feel like, you know, since Syria and now Ukraine, and you've got this real kind of explicit, visible polarization of kind of the global superpowers again. And you can argue whether that was there before anyway, but it's definitely more visible now. And what is that going to do for the way aid is used? You see the rise of new kind of aid donors, such as those like Qatar, these kind of the Gulf states. So what is that going to do to this kind of polarization? How are they going to play? How are they going to shape the field of donor countries? But, you know, how are they going to influence in good and bad ways that politics? And I guess just a final comment, I think if we're thinking about kind of achievements and challenges, one thing that strikes me is, and we definitely think of our own achievements and our own challenges, but I guess the importance of listening to the people that humanitarianism aims to serve in making these judgments. So I've recently been working with some South Sudanese on kind of ethnographic methods of kind of evaluating humanitarian programming, and it is striking when you listen to people carefully what they see as more useful and a bigger achievement, and how that often doesn't tally with kind of what NGOs think is the bigger achievement. So just that kind of final thought of how do we listen better and how do we make those judgments about success in different ways.
It's really quite interesting to listen to you and step back and think, is neutrality one of the strengths of humanitarianism in practice, or is it one that gets in the way of more effective action? I don't know. This is part of what I take away from it, is something that's both relevant to development, but also it seems to be highly relevant in the question of effective action in the context of humanitarian crisis, as it were. Tausif?
Thank you, Mathilde. I mean, I was thinking about challenges in a very different way when you talk about the crises that we understand. Number one is basically the overall idea that these are kind of internal problems and they've got external solutions. I mean, that brings up an entire universe of these colonial structures, the colonial legacies, and the back of your head. You don't even want to talk about those things because everyone knows about those things, yeah? But one of the basic challenges that I feel with the field is that, especially after 2020, we've seen the unfolding of certain crises, for instance, the pandemic, which was global, isn't it? The other important thing was the climate change that's happening and the climate shocks that we're having. The very temporality and the very speciality of these crises is way different than we've known so far. And what we have is the so-called the missionary zeal that we had 150 years ago, that you go with tents and mattresses, and that's your humanitarian aid. But when you talk about situations that are unfolding right now, is this relevant? So the kind of bureaucracy, the kind of architecture, the kind of tools that we have, even when you talk about the war situations with the crises like new wars, which is kind of very diffuse, where there are proxy wars, where there are blurred boundaries between civilians, non-civilians, combatants, armed forces, others. How do you deal with situations like that? How do you deal with situations like a pandemic? How do you deal with climate shocks? And over time, we are seeing that the crises that are happening around us in our world are changing. So is the current system of humanitarian aid industrial complex actually the relevant answer to that thing, or do we need to recalibrate our answers? That's one very important thing that we need to start thinking about before even going into this thing. What are the basic kind of like challenges? The very basic thing for me is to actually challenge the idea whether this is a relevant response right now, given what we would be encountering, because we know what's unfolding around us. Then the other important kind of thing is that when it comes to, if we talk about the current architecture or the current system or machinery of aid, like taking away the problems, one of the basic things, as I said in the previous response as well, was this: do you address the immediate problem or do you address the root cause? And in doing so, I mean, if you're doing one, you're letting people getting killed. If you're doing the other one, it leads to recurrence of this issue. And if you have to do the same thing again and again, are you actually doing any service? So a basic short answer for this kinds of challenges is no doubt that humanitarian aid in terms of the modern humanitarian as we understand it, might have saved lives, but in terms of sufferings, they have actually escalated. They've actually inflated. That's another thing. The other very important thing that is related to this is this idea where we are seeing the coloring of this humanitarian intervention when I talk about this very architecture or this industrial complex, is because now increasingly, especially after the Afghan war, these have become the humanitarian industry, or the humanitarian agencies in many cases have become the extensions of the state, even if there are not many people are increasingly seeing them as such. And that's what led to this idea of bunkerization. What bunkerization basically did is actually it detached these people, it detached the humanitarians basically from the ground situation, and the relevance actually decreases, the connect actually decreases, the kind of interventions actually, I mean, anyway, there was no difference because there's somebody else sitting on a very comfy chair talking and taking decisions and making models. That again brings in another challenge, is this power imbalance. I mean, locals are doing the job, locals know the situation, but there is somebody else who is calling the shots. There's a manager. And when it comes to even bunkerization, you're saving the international fleet that you have. But when it comes to the locals, they're still living in the localities, and many a times they're quite vulnerable as well. The other important thing is the MNC funding, from United Nations to Oxfam to others. It is like you're funded by these corporates, which might be these massive oil and petroleum industries, massive kinds of arms importers or armed industrial complexes. So when they are funding you, you're obliged in a way that when it comes to these situations, you have to think of your self-interest as well, that if I talk about this situation, I might either lose my access or at the same time, my funding might be cut. That again brings in the debate of this principal agent theory at the back of my head. I mean, this massive architecture where even an individual, if they give about £100, at the end of the day, there's the massive bureaucracy, the office, the salaries, and other things. Effectively, maybe £5 or £10 might reach onto the ground. So these are some of the basic kind of challenges, in my opinion, that need to be thought of, that need to be discussed, and that need to be tackled threadbare, from the very idea to the very assumptions to the very implementation of this field. Yeah.
There's a question in the chat, maybe relating to what you were saying just then, Tawsif. Mohammed is asking, you know, there's the violence towards humanitarian workers in Gaza is setting a precedent that even humanitarian workers, no matter how visible they are, will now be a direct target in conflict. Is it something that's unprecedented?
It's, in my opinion, it's unprecedented, but it's precedented as well, because humanitarian, again, the thing is how you imagine this humanitarian action or humanitarian intervention. So the very idea of like, when we talk about this humanitarian intervention, that actually flags in our head is Oxfam or these international organizations going onto the ground. But we do not realize that there are these people who are the first responders, that is the communities themselves, the kind of like groups they have, self-help groups. For instance, in Kashmir, I have seen crisis situations unfold where there have been curfews and lockdowns for more than 6 months without any international aid organization being there. Communities coming up together with foods, rations, and other things, going from these agricultural towns to the cities and distributing it free of cost to the people. Or I'm reminded of the earthquake that hit Kashmir and parts of Pakistan in 2005, where maybe about like 100,000 people died, about 8 or 10 million people got impacted. And what came into the news was the work of the international organizations rather than these groups that were the first responders and were helping, or even the national groups like ED Foundation, who were doing massive amounts of work. That was the highlight. So if for you, aid architecture as the international organization is the first responder, maybe the kind of situation that we're seeing in Gaza is unprecedented. But if you think of this humanitarian intervention in its real essence, where you sort of like unpack it in its reality, then it's not unprecedented in many situations. For instance, the initial history of humanitarian aid, where these aid workers in Europe were going onto the battlefield, they were treating the soldiers, but also getting killed at the same time. So I won't think it in that sense. If in the sense you understand humanitarianism, it won't be unprecedented. But the kind of situation that we are seeing right now that is unprecedented. Again, that also brings in to highlight what I spoke of before, this idea of power imbalance between the international and local. When you talk about Gaza, there might be many humanitarians on the ground, but have a look at the list. It's only the locals who suffer at the end of the day, because the international players are bunkerized, they are protected, they've got insurances, and they are like safely flown out, and the locals at the end of the day are left to die. My opinion completely.
I'm interested in what you're saying in terms of the power imbalance, because what I can see, for example, in countries like Bangladesh, we've seen, you know, a low to medium income country welcoming and becoming a symbol in a way of humanitarianism, given what it's done for the Rohingya brothers, refugee population coming from Myanmar. So it's incredible to see how governments have learned also to deploy, in no time at all, an amount of aid and deploy, you know, humanitarianism structures and deliver aid in a way that's unprecedented, at least in that country. So there's a great deal of learning also from government to government. Also, you know, understanding the implication this then has for other development processes within the country as well, specifically in Bangladesh. Very interesting how, you know, the shift in power in relation to Rohingya crisis has impacted the development process. This speaks quite well to the third theme that we wanted to explore, which is, you know, how do we then understand, in light of the achievement and what we've just discussed, how do we understand the power play or the power structures to have evolved? So we know, for example, in development studies, there is a great call for decolonizing both, you know, concepts, the concept of development and the way that it's practiced, and better engage with political processes to be able to challenge the ways that development is either conceptualized or indeed interventions being designed. And it rings with what you were just talking about then, Tosif. I'm just wondering, is that something that's even achievable? A bit like neutrality in humanitarianism, is decolonizing the humanitarian sector achievable? Is it possible to bring the voices of refugees, or indeed use, you know, refugee-based communities, organizations more to the fore and involve them more strongly into the design of the interventions or of humanitarianism itself?
I mean, of course, but for that to happen, the very idea of humanitarian needs to be reimagined, because I'm reminded of the thing that you can't break the master's house with master's tools. The very beginning or the very foundation of the current humanitarian aid industrial complex, as I understand it, is sort of like, I would be really sort of skeptic to see if it could happen in that way, because there are quite some reasons in that regard. And the thing is that basically, when we talk about this humanitarianism, we have to understand the epistemic violence and nuance the divisions or the difference between humanitarianism in its essence, which is basically about human solidarity and human empathy, the expression of that, especially to relieve the pain and sufferings of fellow humans, irrespective of these social identities or the baggages that they would have. However, the idea of humanitarianism that we understand as the modern humanitarianism, which is more of this organized, institutionalized, and more of secular kind of industrial complex of humanitarian aid that birthed in Europe, that we understand. In terms of that, if we are able to understand that distinction, we would be able to understand that there are certain things that we can do in that regard. I mean, I would say that restoring the agency and leadership in a way back to the ground, to the communities, in terms of dealing with the issue is one of the things that I believe is really important to be done. And for that to be done, what is really important is decentralization of maybe power, decentralization of command, decentralization of resources, so that, because it's the people, it's their problems, let them decide on their own, rather than somebody who doesn't belong to the community, who might not have even experienced that kind of crisis in their life, coming to decide about those things. The other important thing is the structural racisms that are existing in the field. I mean, between the NGOs that I'm talking about, but inter-NGO, the overall architecture, the international architecture, the amount of structural racism, how many people of color, how many brown, black people like me, would you see who are actually heading these organizations, who are actually heading these projects within the countries? Many a times it's definitely speaking, or it highlights this kind of structural racism that's prevalent. The other important thing is the power imbalances that it highlights that are prevalent in the system. So I guess when we understand humanitarian aid or humanitarianism more in its essence as solidarity, as empathy, as empowerment, that in my opinion could answer this question. But if we are trying to imagine humanitarian aid in the lens of, I think I would be a little hesitant in that way, where somebody who is without even being connected to the ground, without being connected to the crises, without having any kinds of expertise. I'm not talking about the degrees that we have here, but expertise in terms of knowing the people, understanding, having a knowledge of that, or belonging to the ground. Without having that, comes to decide about those things. And I mean, in such an environment, I think decolonizing can't actually exist in such an ecosystem. The very ecosystem would need to sort of like alter or change.
I hear what you're saying. It sounds like it resonates with some of this agenda, and we hear about localizations. So can locals, in inverted commas, whoever they are and how they're defined, can locals really do it better? Naomi, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thank you. And I've also noticed in the chat, someone's asked about kind of the localization agenda and the grand bargain. And I'll touch on that. And also kind of there's also things in the chat about this kind of risk to humanitarians. And I think it can all tie together. I mean, we've obviously seen this kind of push for localization. I think one important thing to kind of notice is that most humanitarians for a very long time have been national, have been from the context of conflict. And this isn't just a kind of post-2016 occurrence, and partly because lots of international humanitarian workers there's a risk aversity, either on an individual level or on an organizational level. And so therefore, much kind of delivery of humanitarian aid to the most dangerous places for decades has involved kind of national workers. And I think there's something to think about carefully in that, because this kind of increase in local participation, if that's how we see localization, potentially is problematic if it is representing this idea that kind of local lives are can be put on the line more easily, and that they therefore, there's not an equity in that, there's not a kind of equal valuing of life if kind of national humanitarians are, kind of structurally and intentionally put in higher risk. And of course, these are incredibly dangerous situations. And if you are working to support people in these like awful times when civilians are targeted, it's really hard for safety to be a reality. But a couple of years ago, we did a really large study in South Sudan, and we interviewed a couple of hundred South Sudanese NGO workers, mainly actually working for South Sudanese NGOs, but some working for international NGOs. And what was striking was the many stories when South Sudanese NGO workers working for South Sudanese NGOs have been caught in a context where they wanted to evacuate. They needed to evacuate, kind of armed forces were attacking. Many INGOs and UN were already evacuated, but they didn't have, their organization didn't have funds to get them out. And we spoke to kind of the directors of these organizations and the founders, and they felt kind of a pressure from above to not include proper safety money in their grants because they wouldn't get it funded. So it's things like that. Like, are we, the reality is that these are dangerous places, but are we doing enough as kind of humanitarians and people that support the system to make sure that national staff are kind of equitably treated, that we aren't really being racist in who we think we should keep people safe, like who should be kept safe? Why would it be worse for an international humanitarian worker to be killed as compared to a national one? And I don't think any of us would think that would be the case, but if we look at the funding mechanisms, we look at where money is distributed, then I think often that clearly is the case, that risks are higher for kind of national humanitarians, and that's very much kind of tied in with the way funding is distributed. And some of that is because of pre-financing, which, you know, many of us are familiar with, that instead of kind of funding up front, humanitarian organizations, whether international or national, have to deliver the services and then reclaim funding. And for big international organizations, they can kind of do that more easily. But the kind of precarious situations that many national NGOs have to get into in order to deliver services and then only be paid later. So often they're using volunteers to do the work. They don't have money to get people out if there's an emergency. And so kind of ironically, the humanitarian system is making some of the most vulnerable kind of skilled workers in the world in these really difficult contexts, making them even more vulnerable, by making them volunteer, by kind of putting them on front lines, by not making sure they have kind of money to allow safe evacuations. And I think that's part of this kind of the social norms that can shape both who is seen to be as important to keep safe, but also then who is seen as important to listen to, and the kind of social world of kind of the humanitarian sector, I think, is really important to think about critically. Like, where does power lie? Where are decisions really made? In some humanitarian emergencies, you've seen the growth of the cluster system. Everyone is at the cluster system. Loads of kind of local and national humanitarians. But then decisions are no longer made in the clusters. They're made elsewhere. They're made over dinner, late at night, over a glass of wine. And who gets access to those real decision-making moments? And what is the kind of power and politics that's often quite subtle, that's at play in the reality of the way these systems work?
There's so many synergies with the work in development studies around participation and the use and the abuse of participation in practice, and what it actually means to you know, design meaningful participation in the shaping of an intervention. Tausif, would you like to add?
Yes, I mean, this idea of localization actually came up in the Humanitarian Exchange Conference the other day as well. And I was sort of like thinking about this thing that when we talk about localization, what Naomi very brilliantly said, I mean, I agree to all of that completely. But oftentimes what happens is that we forget and we take the idea of local as a monolith. For instance, I'm thinking of a civil war situation where there is a lot of like strife and a lot of wedge between the different communities. In such a situation, who decides who the local is? Because the very idea or the very term local is quite unstable, quite relational. So many a times treating that as a monolith does create problems. So localization, without sort of like operationalizing it in the right perspective, might create problems. The other thing is that if you come to then support one local group, it might raise or it might create more tensions on the ground, where one kind of people might feel sort of like abused or discriminated against the other. And we've seen it unfold in many kinds of conflicts, from Rwanda to other places. Then the other very important thing is this romanticization of the idea of local. For instance, talk about a conflict situations. Many a times what happens is these local divisions create intrastate or civil war kind of situations. And if you're trying to reinforce this, it might actually escalate the problem rather than actually solving the problem. Or locals, sometimes the idea of like gendered violence, pushing the people who are marginalized, pushing them to the wall, if you're continuing the kind of dynamics that are prevalent in the society by sort of like empowering those things. So as I said in my previous answer, I believe, I mean, localization as the idea of decentralization, qualifying it rather than taking it as a monolith, might be something where the practitioners as well as the thinkers or theorists might have to very critically engage in qualifying and operationalizing how you think about this idea of local, and how do you sort of like tease it out from maybe decentralization that might be more relevant than actually romanticizing the idea of local sometimes.
Thank you. I'm mindful of time, and just to wrap up. So part of what you said, I find it particularly interesting in the case of state-sponsored violence towards its own civilians, and the question that raises in terms of the contextual power dynamics could be very different, and the idea of the local being somehow apolitical becomes indeed very problematic. Looking forward then, both of you, and you've got 1 minute to answer this. What to you are the main or the key opportunities to reimagine humanitarianism? Because we depicted, and some people have picked it up in the chat, quite a not a dark, a challenging picture of what humanitarianism has achieved, and we've tried to keep the conversation quite balanced with recognizing some of the technical achievement and what it has done, but also spent some time highlighting some of the tensions and dilemmas that it's confronted with. So within 1 minute, no pressure, could you try and think with us where the opportunities to reimagine humanitarianism lie, according to you? Maybe Naomi, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clearly a moment of crisis because we are focused on protecting civilians and saving lives, and that is not happening. And so I think there is a moment to think about what humanitarianism is about and what is the kind of best of what we do. And in that, I would really advocate for this kind of change of who we're listening to when we make those decisions. Who is deciding what humanitarianism is about? And is there an opportunity in these moments, both because kind of the major powers are polarized and distracted by themselves, but also because you have new donors and you have new voices, which everyone around the world can hear through things like social media? Is this a moment when new people can help us reimagine what humanitarianism is?
Perfect. That was just a minute.
I might be less than a minute. So I'm actually reminded of the Australian artist, academic Leela Watson's quote. It is like, if you come to help me, then you're wasting your time. If you come to help because your liberation is bound up with mine, then you're most welcome. Let's try together. So understanding humanitarianism in its essence, rather than this qualified jacketed term as the modern aid architecture. So understanding humanitarianism in its essence and not understanding humanitarianism as a tool of hegemony might be the solution. So critically engaging with all of these aspects, from the way we teach in the universities, from the way we engage with the students, from the way we talk about these things in the public, in maybe alternate and mainstream media, to the kind of practices we animate on the ground. These need to be critically teased out. And creating these sort of like one-size-fits-all models won't serve the purpose, because each context, each situation is absolutely different, and each situation would need different kinds of solutions, which can basically and principally be decided and informed by the people that are impacted.
Thank you. And the absolute priority, I guess, would be responsibilities towards civilians.
Absolutely.
The protection of civilians. Thank you very much. Great. Shall we turn our attention to the chat, where we've had a few questions raised? Which one would you like to pick first?
First come, first serve.
Okay. So Soledad raised a question around the geopolitical nature of funding. I think Tausif touched upon that after that question was raised. So unless you would like to clarify or further discussion on this, Soledad.
Just a little addition to this. I mean, it's absolutely the way we are understanding funding right now is absolutely political, driven by national interest and other things. For instance, look at the governments, UK, US, who've been funding countries like Jordan, Lebanon, and even Egypt right now to function as warehouses where they can incorporate these refugees rather than them having to come onto their shores. So majority of the funding in that sense is quite driven by the national interests of the countries, by the geopolitics. And I mean, it again builds up in this neoliberalist idea that keeping these countries maybe safe or under control is actually good for us at the same time, because it would actually protect and prevent those people turning onto our shores and creating problems in our home, they can remain as far as possible. So many times that's quite a bit of interest, self-interest, national interest involved.
Yeah.
And sorry.
Oh no, go ahead, Naomi.
No, and I was only going to say, kind of within that, I think our governments are pretty clear that the kind of national interest is at stake, and that some of that is appealing to their own electorate, and I don't think that's a kind of hidden reality. But there's also this concern with funding the wrong people. Like, what if we accidentally kind of give funds that end up going to the wrong kind of groups, terror groups or whatever else. And we know that's caused big problems. There's been really interesting work on the Somalia famine and how those kind of de-risking kind of moves really prevented kind of global networks of support and kind of ended up in famine deaths. So there's this kind of concern of it going to the wrong people, but then actually does that sometimes cause like large scale kind of humanitarian crises, the largest kind of famine in the last 10 years or so. So I think there's that kind of concern of where the money's coming from, where it goes to, and whose interests are at stake, and what risks we're willing or not willing to take. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you for clarifying. We've got another question, probably to Tassif. How and what would decentralization look like in practice if you reimagine a humanitarian sector that's more decentralized? What do you think it can look like?
Decentralization, in my opinion, I did touch upon that in the answer to the question on decolonization. So decentralization is reimagining the very architecture, the very power relations of how we understand the aid works. Number one, I mean, there needs to be a basic reimagination of humanitarian intervention from the missionary idea of charities and other things who are going into different contexts. That's number one. But I highlighted certain things in terms of the reconceptualization of the idea of agency and leadership. Whose agency, whose leadership when we are talking about these situations? Addressing these ideas about structural racisms that are prevalent within the NGOs, within the country, between the countries, between the NGOs, between the larger architecture. That's another important thing. Also critically engaging with the idea of power imbalances that are existing. So I guess those are the initial steps towards decentralization. Then again, coming to the main point that I highlighted, each and every situation is absolutely different. There can't be there are similarities, but they are not the same. So for each and every situation, it might be different. For instance, when we talk about this idea of localization, it might be absolutely perfect for certain situations. But when you talk about divided societies, it might wreak havoc. Or about these power hierarchies and the power relations. So having these basic sort of engagements with regard to agency, leadership, resources, hierarchies, power relations, power imbalances, and then sort of like understanding the local context, local dynamics, and devising strategies by the people who are concerned on the ground, who know the situation, who know the context. That might be the initial step to us understanding or imagining properly or effective and morally coherent idea of decentralization, in my opinion.
Thank you very much. I think it's time to wrap up. There was a particular comment I wanted to highlight from Mohammed Rezek Al-Dalu from the Gaza Strip right now, and raising some questions as to, how can humanitarian aid from the US be accepted in Gaza, given the geopolitical situation. A huge question. I'm sorry we can't do it justice right now, but happy to be in touch. And please contact Tausif, Naomi, or myself if you'd like to carry on the conversation. I think the last thing for me to do, it's 1:30, is to thank you all for coming and for participating and asking some great questions in the chat, challenging our views as well. There was a lot of challenging ideas and comments in the chat which we've taken on board. The conversation can continue, so please do email us and be in touch. I'll leave you, Naomi and Tausif, for closing remarks.
I mean, the only thing that comes to my mind after hearing about Muhammad is lots of prayers and love to all of you, especially the people in Gaza who are suffering, and feel very sorry.
Yeah, and just to say thank you again for joining us. I know you're in many places and your jobs are really varied, but yeah, thank you for taking the time to step back and think for a minute. And yeah, and I guess I'd encourage you to keep asking difficult questions, but do reach out to us and we can keep the conversation going.
Totally.
Many thanks. Bye.
Bye.